Weeds! If you're anything like me, they really stress you out. Why is it that everybody's garden you look at never has any weeds? And why is it that even when there's a drought, weeds still seem to grow? And why is it that as much as they pull them, there's always more? So we're going to look at the garden, I'm going to feel shame about how many weeds there are. And we're going to look at the ways that we can deal with weeds, and I'm going to follow my own advice in trying to eradicate them. So are you ready for the monstrosity that is the weed garden? Here it is. Ta-da! Weeds everywhere. This should be the flower garden, except there's so much of a drought, nothing is growing. We do have, as you can see, lots and lots of weeds, more weeds, more weeds, and everything is so behind because it's so dry and I don't have any water. Even the cornflowers aren't coping very well. I'm going to have to sow another succession because they're starting to go over because of the dryness. And then up here is even worse, if you can imagine it. This is, or supposed to be, the market garden. Look at the state of it. And it really is no wonder that actually when you come out to a garden like this and you just see it covered in weeds and you don't see any produce, that you start to really feel quite downhearted and disappointed with everything. But I suppose my first tip is that if you do have weeds, just take it on the chin and relax, because actually amongst the weeds there are good stuff. So I still have chard down here. I still have some lettuces. Amongst this weedy patch, I actually have some very nice courgettes coming on, although they're starting to turn into marrows. Amongst this horrendous patch, you wouldn't think there's anything but weeds, but there are carrots. And then if I take you over here, again, look at this. This is just weeds, right? But actually it's not. Amongst here, there are some really fat onions. There are some really nice beets. And there are some really nice garlics. So I think a key thing to remember, especially when you're starting out a brand new garden, is there are always going to be weeds. It takes a long time to eradicate weeds, and you probably feel shame about the number of weeds in the garden and you don't want to show it off to people, but it's a fact of life. The other thing that when it comes to your crops is weeds are plants that are growing. They have evolved to grow in your patch. So when you're growing your vegetables and the weeds are outstripping them, it's because those weeds are made to be there, and it can be a long process of getting rid of weeds. So try, and I haven't achieved this completely yet, but try not to get overcome by the number of weeds mentally, because they're going to be there. You've just got to tackle them. My next tip is to tackle little and often. Now, it's part of the course that actually most of the time we set aside some time and we go and do a blitz of weeds in the garden. And obviously that works for the short term because suddenly it looks amazing. But the problem with that is, as you're weeding, you're dropping all of those seeds, if they're flowering, into the soil, and you're also opening up the seed bed. So although you've suddenly made that patch look better, if you don't then go and tackle it on a consistent basis, all those weeds are going to come straight back up. So it's much better to go in every day and just do a little bit of weeding and chip away at it, because then you can keep going over and over and over patches and taking out the weeds. Of course, this is something I still need to learn and I am not proficient in at all. Another tip is to not let your weeds flower, because as soon as they flower and they go to seed, they're making more weeds. Now, as you can see, I haven't been very good at this either. But if you need to target anything, go through and take off any weeds that are starting to flower and set seed, because they're the ones that are going to cause the most nuisance in the long run. Another tip is to try and limit the places that weeds can grow. So for instance here, where it's appropriate, I've been using landscape fabric, and then obviously the weeds will still come, but they can only go through the holes you've got. So if we go to the marrow bed, for example, we're pretty free and easy of weeds because the marrow plants themselves take up most of that hole in the middle. Oh blimey, look at that. That's definitely no longer courgette, that's a marrow. But they take up most of the holes and don't allow the weeds through. And densely packing your crops or your flowers together also helps. So for instance, here are my Sweet Williams, and you can see that they are so close together, they don't really allow much light through to the ground underneath, and there are barely a weed in sight. A couple down here, look, where light's got through. But when you've just got a couple of weeds like this, it's a lot easier to manage. The lack of rain we're having has been pretty lethal to most of my salad veg. And these actually, although they look like weeds, these are actually lettuces. But I need to pull them out and feed them to the pigs. It looks like actually the UK is going to officially go into drought because we've had so little rain. So it's obviously a really hard year for everyone. As you might expect, on a brand new site as well, weeds are always going to be worse. We've actually only been on this site for just coming up to 2 years, and the first year was a test, so this is really year one. So we're still obviously tackling vast amounts of weed, and when you've got 37 acres of that, trying to stop weeds blowing in is an impossibility. And like with any business, when you're first starting out, things are a lot harder and things are also a lot more vulnerable and fragile. So there's more weeds and the market garden is more vulnerable and fragile to weeds coming in. Also the business, of course, is more fragile, but also our poor trees. At this point in time, everything you're still trying to establish. So we've been given trees that we put in and they are just suffering, partly from escaped goats, which nibbled all their leaves early, but most definitely from the major drought. So I spend a lot of my time walking around with water, trying just to salvage what I can. I have to say it's also been a pretty negative video against the poor old weed, and actually weeds can also be marvellous. This wild carrot, for example, I have been picking loads to put into flower bouquets. While they start off with this beautiful lacy flower, as they dry, they turn into this, which I also think is stunning. So actually, if you keep your arrangement long enough, gradually you'll see your lacy flowers turning into a little architectural basket of joy. Of course, thistles may look horrendous to us because look at all those seeds, but these are fantastic for birds, especially goldfinches, which land and eat all of these seed heads. The same with these thistles here. And I have to say that the goats adore chomping these. So you often walk around my farm and you find them chomped off like that, and that's because the goats come along and they chomp off the heads. They just love it. Ragwort, of course, is a very contentious weed in the countryside because it is toxic to animals, especially more so when it's dried into hay and forage and it loses its bitter taste, and so animals eat it more. But on the farm, it's also a fantastic plant for wildlife. Cinnabar moths use this as their food source, and it has so much pollen. Nettles, of course, offer a fantastic food source for some of the most beautiful British butterflies we have. And as you know, I was releasing some butterflies that I found the caterpillars on the farm and reared them, and we were up to 197 butterflies we released. And then, of course, brambles. Look at that, at this time of year, the bramble, the humble bramble, is starting to produce all this wonderful fruit. I'm yet to find a redeeming feature for dock, of course, other than rubbing it on your nettle stings. And I have rather a lot. All of that rusty red is dock. If you've got a redeeming feature for it, please let me know in the comments, because I need to find some reason not to hate it. Teasels are another massive love of mine. I put them into flower bouquets when they're kind of a bit earlier than this, they're green, and if you leave them in the vase long enough, they'll actually soak up enough water to flower, so they'll go from green to purple, and they'll lose their flowers and become spiky. And of course, dried teasels are fantastic in dried flower arrangements, but also crafting. And I've been selling quite a few of last year's teasels at markets for exactly that purpose. So yes, weeds, or as is actually the definition, a plant that's in the wrong place, a plant that is where you don't want it to be, can actually be really positive. In the garden, of course, they're a nightmare. And they can overcome you, but also you can actually use a lot. So you'll see in my garden there are quite a lot of teasels, there are quite a lot of oxeye daisies, there are quite a lot of little tiny Shasta daisy things that I just allow because I can use them all. But I guess the moral of the story is there will always be weeds. Try not to feel shamed about the weeds in your garden because we all have them, and I probably have more than many of you. And it's just a process of gradual elimination. If you want to find out more about our butterfly release, check out this video, which is also the video we made up our first chicken tractor.